Welcome to the Immigrant Entrepreneurs Show, where our mission is to inspire, impact, and influence other immigrant entrepreneurs to follow their dreams and create the future they want. My guest today is Dan Norenberg, and Dan is actually an exception to the rule because we usually have immigrants who are residing in North America and have moved to North America. And Dan is actually from North America and he's living in Europe. Dan, welcome to the show.
Ali, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here, and I love your resource. And even though I've swam the river in the other direction, I'm learning a lot from your show, and it's a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you so much, Dan. Thank you for making the time. And, it's interesting, as I said, because usually we have people coming this direction. Now you went the other way. Please tell us where you live and, where exactly you are based.
I live and work out of Munich, Germany, which is in Bavaria. Bavaria is the Texas, if you will, of the German Republic, and came for a 9-day holiday. We'll probably talk about that. Just taking a little break from my time in Los Angeles, and 35 years later, I'm still here. So now I have a wife and 2 adult children, and have built a couple of businesses here. And as much as I love the States, this is home because my wife is German, and she'd like to stay here close to her relatives. So that's why we're
Interesting. Interesting. So what made you move to Germany 35 years ago?
Well, it didn't start as a move. It started as a 9-day holiday. And my background is in psychology and criminology. I grew up in the Midwest. My parents are both educators, so I was always really into education, and Iowa was just a great place to grow up. It's a little bit like Walt Disney, if you will, the Midwest. And I went to California. I thought to go to law school, but I ended up in a place called Silicon Valley and ended up working with a couple of high-tech companies in their marketing and sales groups that grew really, really fast. So I had a lot of opportunities at a really young age, which I was really grateful for. And unfortunately, the photovoltaic company that I was with went out of business. And I was just pretty devastated. And my girlfriend and I had broken up. We sold the house in Palo Alto. And I thought, you know what? I've never been to Europe because I played football in both high school and college. So I was always training in the summer. I could never take those summer holidays that some kids did. And so I said in my early 30s, I'm going to go to Europe for 9 days. I'm going to clear my head, and I'm going to come back and tackle my next big thing, which I had no idea what it was. And Ali, I flew to Europe, and it just kind of knocked my socks off. I just thought I went to Paris. I went down to Switzerland, to Geneva. I went to Fribourg, Switzerland, which you're probably also familiar with. Came up through Stuttgart, and my 9 days were up, and I had just got a taste of Europe and ended up extending it for about 3 more weeks. And the answer to your question, without getting too long here, but the answer to your question about what caused you to live here, it was really a dream, if you will. And one of my last nights in Europe, when I was getting ready to go back to California, I dreamt that I was 80 years old, and I saw myself back in California, pushing the lawnmower, 2 kids, 2 cars, which sounded like just like a wonderful thing. I was single at the time, but I thought to myself when I was 80, I thought, am I ever going to look back to that time? I was just in my early 30s. I had no job. I had no commitments. Will I ever regret that I didn't spend more time in Europe? And I've got a pretty sensitive nose for regret. I really attempt to live a life without regrets. So I think about that when I have a major decision. And to make a long story short, I thought if I went back to the States now, I'll always kind of be in the back of my head. So I said, you know what? I'm just going to go back to Munich. I was in Paris at the time, waiting for my flight. And the person I was staying with, she said, well, you're going back to Munich. You don't speak any German. You don't know anybody. You don't have any work papers. I said, I know. I'm just going to go back and see what happens. And that was really the start. So, I think maybe for your listeners, this whole idea of regret, maybe some people have a job and they're thinking, how do I start my own thing, which involves a lot of risk. And, but maybe using regret as a filter, like, 40 years from now, will will I regret not doing something? It doesn't mean taking uncalculated risks, but it's changed my life. And as much as I love the States and I'm always going to be American, I'm really grateful that I came here because it led me to my wife and to the work I do now, which is different than what I did in the States.
Mm, thank you. And before we get into what you do and how you do it, maybe I wonder. Usually, people come to the US for the land of opportunities, right? And I can confirm it is the land of opportunities. And you're, as I said, you're the exception or the minority that goes the other way. And I can imagine, as an American living in Europe, let's not be too specific, but living in Europe in general, it comes, with, I would say, with learnings and with experiences that are different than the US. Tell us more about that. What are the things that you're like, hey, I had to adapt when I came to Europe. These things were way different than how I was used to doing things, and maybe also in business and in personal life.
Well, that's a great question. That's a really great question. I mean, there are just a couple things that come to mind before I specifically address that. And one was maybe there was some foreshadowing. I remember when I was in the fifth grade. I mean, I grew up in Iowa. It's a lovely place, but it's a lot of cornfields. It's farm and family and sports, and I just love that environment. But I remember in the fifth grade, looking out the classroom window. In those days, the windows were like 1.5 meters wide and 2 meters high. There was no safety thing. I mean, you could have thrown a desk out the window. Nobody'd think about jumping out the window. But I remember looking out the window in fifth grade. I can remember it like it was yesterday, and just seeing miles and miles of cornfields and Interstate 35, which runs east and west across Iowa. The school was right near the interstate, and just thinking, what's beyond the horizon there? What's out there? And I was never unhappy really growing up in Iowa and then later living in California. That's quite an international environment there. And in California, what I found was, even though I'm a white European male, from Iowa, I really appreciated the California diversity and all the different cultures that live there. There's so many different influences in California. And I lived in San Francisco and also in LA. I just found that fabulous. I was just very curious. I learned a lot about myself and about other people. So one of the things about Europe is because it's so compacted, you've got so many different countries and cultures so close to each other. I can drive 2 or 3 hours in any direction. They're speaking another language. And I think I also dreamt of speaking another language, which I, started to learn German when I was 30, and now I've got that. And so that's a little bit about what it was for me. But it was very different, just things that you think that the way that you do things at home is the way that everybody does it, but you realize that there's a lot of different ways to do similar things. And one of my big takeaways that I've gained from this sort of European community is it isn't about good or bad or right or wrong. It's just about different. And I learned that that just because somebody is different from me doesn't make it better or worse. It just makes it different. And those differences really can enhance my life, and they certainly have. So, but there were a lot of really interesting experiences, and one of it just comes to my mind, in the first days I'm here, and Germans look like me, or I look like Germans, if you will. So I didn't look like I was an outsider, if you will. But I go to the supermarket and I'm standing there, which is not very exciting shopping in Germany. It's really kind of a drab experience, or it was 30 years ago. But I'm standing in line to pay at the cashier, and somebody comes and stands in front of me. And so, of course, I'm not working at that time. I'm just wandering around. So I'm thinking, okay, maybe this person is buying for his grandmother, or maybe he works for a hospital. Maybe there's a code in Germany, that people that have an emergency can go ahead of other people, which you just don't do in the States,
Right.
So, this happened several times over a couple of weeks. And then finally I started getting like, hey, Germans are just outright rude. I mean, what is this? Why would people be crowding in line? They don't even say anything. And then I found a piece of advice that somebody gave me is to find a buddy. When you scuba dive, you always dive with someone else. So talk to a German who understands also some of the other cultural nuances of other cultures. So I said, hey, there's this thing about people crowding in line and it really bothers me. And why are Germans so rude? And he said, well, where are you standing in the line? I said, well, I'm standing behind the person in front of me. He said, well, how close are you? I said, well, I'm giving a good yard, a yard and a half, because in the States, we've got a lot of space. We don't want to crowd people. And he said, in Germany, you're not in line.
Right.
We've got 83 million people that live in an area the size of Wisconsin. And if you're not really scooted right up next to that person, they don't think you're in line. So
Right.
again, a small thing, but just learn that,
Dan, how much do you think moving to another country as an American outside of the US helps or helped you when you moved there first expand your horizon and then also transition that expansion of horizon in personal but also in business?
Oh, that's another great question. It just was a total game changer for me. It's like, and it's no criticism of the U.S. I had a wonderful life there. Was there till my early 30s. It was brilliant. It was just a sort of a move that I made to sort of explore that, not wanting to regret things, but it just opened my life up personally and professionally, and it also presented me with constraints because I was American. I had no work papers. I spoke no German, and I didn't know anybody. So I had no networks. There wasn't a family I was staying with. I didn't have a rich girlfriend taking care of me. So those constraints led me to, how do I use English, which now, English is pretty spoken worldwide, but this was like 1989, 1990 when I first came here. Was no, internet was still, in the development area. So I thought, how can I use my English, to help me? And one of the things that I noticed was there were a lot of language schools here based in Germany, and there were a lot of management training companies in German, but there really weren't any, I had a background in marketing and sales, but I always was interested in training and Tony Robbins and self-motivation. And I was sort of a weekend seminar junkie. And I saw that there was an opportunity that I could sort of position myself as a coach, consultant, trainer, English speaking management training, very pragmatic, team building, presenting, negotiation, sales training, strategic selling. And it was a niche in the marketplace that was not being covered. And that became my start. So that gave me a legitimate reason to stay here, because then I could apply for a residence permit, because no German could do the job as a native English speaker in this kind of training area. So I was able to secure legal status as a freelance person with no burdens. Didn't burden the German social system. And it taught me another thing, that we often complain about constraints, or I don't have money, I don't have time, or there's a lot of big companies in that area. Constraints are catalysts for innovation. And it later helped me start, that became a business with 15 consultants, and we did a lot of management training all over Europe, all over the world, a 7-figure leadership boutique, which really was I ran that for 25 years. So that came as a result of dealing with those differences and those constraints that I was initially faced with, which I could have just curled up in a corner and went back to LA and had a comfortable life. But I said, no, I'll stick this out and see what comes of this. And I won't say it was easy. The first 5 years were very difficult, but it reminded me even today that when I see constraints, or I hear people talking about constraints, I'm looking for, what's the problem to be solved? What's the opportunity? Things like that.
So now we got close to the boiling point in terms of interest and curiosity of the listeners and the viewers. Tell us what you do and who you work with.
Well, today I work as an executive advisor. So I advise and coach executive and strategic leadership teams. And maybe that's a topic. So that's what I do today. That evolved from 3 different phases. The first phase, I would say I was a sort of an an immigrant freelancer who was trying to develop a in German we would say a Beruf. I was trying to
Mm-hmm.
develop this occupation as a trainer, coach, facilitator, and did a number of training and certifications and things like that. And started working as a freelance consultant. Uh, Started my own business by sitting at a table much like this with the German telephone book. This was back in the day. This was back in the
Mm-hmm.
night. And I would just go through the telephone book and look for the bold names, which meant they were companies. And I would call them in the most primitive German and try to sell myself as a communications trainer, sales trainer in English to support their export activities, either somewhere else in Europe or around the world. And I won a few clients. And through that time, then I met some people from Siemens, large German multinational, and they really liked my background in sales and marketing, psychology, negotiation. And I was invited to join their executive development team as a freelance consultant. So I worked with Siemens for about 5 years in England, in France, all over Germany. And that really helped me, let's say, develop the tools of a Meister, of a master facilitator, trainer, coach, and things like that. And then I started my own company called Envision Learning, which was a leadership boutique. And we provided talent management programs for companies like the Allianz Group, Lego, Disney, the European Patent Office, and did that for 25 years. And now I don't have that company anymore. And now I work on my own, just advising senior leadership teams.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. When you started as a freelancer, I imagine being in a country that you don't even speak the language the way probably you do now, not even close to that, I assume. And, moving away from home and being in a place that is totally new to you, working as a freelancer itself comes with a lot of uncertainty. You don't know what's going on. You don't know how much money you're going to make the next few months. What was that like for you? Or did you had a lot of financial support from family and back home maybe?
No, no. Um, I read something the other day by who wrote this? Forgive me for a second. I'm reading so many books right now. Um, but it was essentially James Baldwin.
Mm-hmm.
Baldwin, a philosopher. He died, I think, in the 60s or 70s. And he said that we shouldn't, if people don't suffer, if we take the suffering away from people, they never get to know themselves. And so for it's all relative, right? I mean, I'm not living, there's certain parts of the world that people are just scraping for their next meal, you
Mm-hmm.
know? But for me, I really struggled the first couple of years. I went from having a great job, living on the beach, access to a company jet that I could not order, but I could fly on, in those tech companies. I mean, I was under 30 flying in a private jet. I mean, this was
Mm-hmm.
like I died and gone to heaven.
Mm-hmm.
And within a period of 24 months, I'm living in the student dormitories. Uh, I think I was budgeted on about $10 a week. It was a lot of spaghetti with ketchup. Now, for a lot of people, that still would be a nice meal. So I'm very sensitive about what I say, that I know that a lot of your listeners probably have come from much scarcer backgrounds than I have. But for me, relatively speaking, it was really rock bottom with all my friends in the States buying their second car, their lake house, their, 4 flat screen TVs. I didn't even have an apartment and I was in my early 30s. And so you start to question yourself, gosh, Dan, you were really off on this fast track. And now now the roller coaster is really scraping on the bottom. Have you lost it all? And so it was kind of a combination of being terrified and also being very excited about really experiencing life. And I just felt like I felt like I was getting closer to my sweet spot. And that sweet spot is when you do what you love doing, you do what you're good at doing, and then there's an opportunity in the marketplace that provides value for what you do. And I think that's the intersection of all those three. And I felt like I was really working towards the sweet spot of my life. For some people it's working in a laboratory or something, but it took I would say 4 or 5 years before it really broke open. And then
Mm-hmm.
it broke open in I wasn't a digital company, so it didn't scale in the multitudes of millions, but finally that hard work, that dedication, that effort, it did go geometrically. It did grow pretty significantly.
Hmm. So during that times, that you just kept pushing through, what was it that kept you going?
I would wake up in the morning and just think, I only got to go through one more day, and I would also think, what if I was starting over from scratch right now? What if I was starting over like brand new? And I thought, the last 2 years, a lot of failures, a lot of experiences, but I'm also gaining some momentum. And one of the stories I read as a little boy was a story about out in California where a guy had a gold mine and he worked for like 3.5 years to find the gold vein that he, back in the California days. And he finally got frustrated and he stopped and he sold that piece of land. And somebody came and dug another meter and a half, another yard and a half, and hit the gold vein. I think there's also something to be said about to know when to stop something, And I was, let's say, blessed. I was fortunate. At that time I didn't have a wife, I didn't have children, I didn't have any obligations. I didn't get any money from home. I even worked myself into a pretty good debt, which I've learned that's also not a nice place to be when you're trying to repay debt on interest and things like that when you're running a business. But I was fortunate I didn't have to serve other people. I only had to serve myself.
Mm. And one thing I was also reading in a book the other day is that when the universe, God, whoever you believe in, if you create a situation that is unfortunate for whatever reason, if you got yourself into that situation, universe or God is supporting you and will give you everything you need to also get out of that situation. You just need to keep a clear head and see the big picture, and then work on your mindset and push yourself out of that situation.
That's a great insight. And if we go back and read about historical figures, from any different culture, I mean, life is about, failing and succeeding. It's about suffering and enjoying. And I think the challenges today with a lot of the sort of digital realities, we sort of get a lot of things presented to us. If we consume those, and they're usually sort of upside things, people driving the nice car, making money really fast, or things like that. Think, well, there's no suffering there, but suffering is a part of growth and development and self discovery. So it helped me mold myself, and I'm very grateful for those experiences.
Mm. So then, when you work with executive teams, what do you help them with? When they come to you, what results, let's say, do you help them to get?
Yeah. Let me step back one step because I think it's a great question, but I think just to lay a little bit of foundation there,
Mm-hmm.
there's not an organization in the world today that doesn't have some kind of let's say team development approach in their company, right? Like, why teamwork's important and working with teams, or even leadership. And most companies of any size or any stature have sort of a systematic approach to developing their leaders. But what I recognized was there are not very many very senior leadership teams. I mean, these are the men and women that sit at the very top of the organization, or they run a special function like supply chain or product management or manufacturing or sales or marketing or research and development. I'm talking about those teams. And what I realized through my work with the organization I own, this company called Envision Learning, we were a talent management for the middle of the organization. But what I realized, those senior teams did not really have any kind of external support to hold them accountable and to challenge them to pay at the next level of performance. They're all very smart people. They're all very ambitious people. They all know their business area very, very well. But when I got invited to start working with them, and it started with an invitation, Dan, our executive team is struggling. They don't communicate with each other very well. They don't collaborate with each other. They're not really fulfilling the strategic expectations that the holding board has. Could you look at them? Could you talk to them? And what I saw was ambitious, motivated, intelligent, hardworking, knowledgeable in their in their business expertise, but as an organizational unit, they just didn't play well together. They just didn't play well together. And that was my sort of invitation into the C-suite. So my work with the leadership team could be about improving communication, improving the way they give feedback to each other, helping them be sharper on their strategy. Because the reality is, probably, no, I think it's not probably, only 5% of executive teams have any sort of systematic approach to continuous improvement for their leadership team. Okay, I mean that's an amazing number, and I've worked with over 150 leadership teams. So my feeling is, if you don't have a plan to continuously improve your leadership team, how can you improve the entire organization? And I think that many leadership teams get in the situation because at the very top they've got a lot on their dashboard. There's a lot of problems to solve, and they often jump in and start putting out fires and working on operational issues and doing things, but they don't really do what we're told when we get on an airplane, the oxygen mask rule. First take care of yourself and then take care of others. That's not selfish. That's not self-centered. You've got to take care of yourself before you can take care of others. You've got to love yourself before you can love someone else. So with these leadership teams, what I help them understand is, the more that you commit to self-improvement, if you guys improve 3, 4, 5, 10% in the senior leadership team, that will be a huge multiplier and set a great example for the rest of the organization. So that's what I do. There are some leadership teams that think we're at the top, we're too busy, we don't have the time, or what they don't say is we're already good enough. And quite honestly, in the last 15 years, 150 leadership teams on 3 continents, I've never yet seen a leadership team that didn't have some room for improvement. And if we look at the National Hockey League, baseball, football, Premier League, I don't see very many of those top teams without any coaches on the sideline. Mm-hmm. So, in fact, they all do, because they want that extra 2%. So I'm looking to connect with those leadership teams that say, we realize that we're the catalyst for growth in our business. We're the catalyst for speed. And it's an exciting business. And most of the time, the men and women are exciting and motivated to work with and interested in learning some of my tools that I've learned over the years. And I wrote a book about it, Executive Ownership. I'll send you a copy after we get off our call today. And it's a pragmatic collection of things that leadership teams can use. And you don't have to be a senior leadership team to use those.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I'm looking forward to receiving the book. Thank you so much. So do you just mentioned 3 continents. You work or have been working with executive teams in 3 continents. Is there a difference between leadership teams in the US and in Europe? And if yes, what are those?
Yes, there are. Let me first say that most of my work, I'm very rarely working with a homogeneous team, like of all Germans or all Swiss or all French. At the senior level of a mid-sized or a large organization, I work with startups, just startups, coming out of a university research, all the way up to multi-billion-dollar organizations. But even in those settings, they're almost always 99.9% of the time a mixture of a Swiss guy, a French guy, an Argentinian guy, a Mexican guy. And when I say guy, I mean men or women. And of course, those cultural issues, when we're under pressure, we tend to go back to our motherboard programming. So it's hard to make a distinction simply between, American and German teams. But naturally, there are cultural differences. There are some things that, there's some things that are very German about Germans. There's things that are very American about Americans. But it's the makeup of the entire team that you have to use to go forward.
Are you working with leadership teams in in specific industries?
I've worked in the pharma area, in pharmaceutical area, in aerospace, in automotive, and in service industries, financial. So for me, there isn't really, I'm not really industry specific. I'm more specific to the dynamics and improvement of that organizational unit called the executive team, either at the very top level or at the strategic level. That's my area of expertise.
I see. Okay, before we're almost at the end of the interview, but before we come to wrapping up, I wonder, what do you see between those leaders? Is there a commonality between those leaders that you say like, hey, these guys are really, they have it under control. They are on top of their game. Is there a commonality that you see between all these leaders? And if yes, what is it?
Great question. There are two things, really. One is an alignment of the overall focus of where they're going. So having this compelling mission or vision to do something like you see at NVIDIA or at Google or something like that, this really aspiring thing, maybe the early days at Apple. So I mean, sharing a vision, a compelling vision is really, really important. It sounds really easy, but in some companies it's not that clear. That's that's the obvious answer. But the answer that people don't talk about, that I know because of my expertise, is what I call the characteristic of having resilient relationships in the team. That means the ability, like if we were on a leadership team together, that I could critique or give you feedback about things that are working well and maybe not so well in your group. And in many leadership teams today, it's never written, it's never spoken, but it's kind of taboo. I run this business, you run that business. We all sit in the leadership team, but I'm the king of my empire here, And what I've noticed, that teams that really are highly effective, that can create compelling, exciting, inspiring work environments, and to continue to outpace their competition, are those teams that possess this, and I write about it in the book, resilient relationships, that we can give each other hard, critical feedback, not about the person, but about the task, and that we stay in that space, and that we can respect that feedback and we can grow from it. Because at the end of the day, I go into work with a team. Forgive me for sounding bold here, but I'm very good at what I do. And I have quite a few clients that continue to come back to work with me. But as I tell my clients that I'm there to serve them and they can use me either in the group setting or in an individual coaching session, but the most powerful resource that any executive has, man or woman, is the leadership team that surrounds them. And not enough leaders or teams have come to grips with that this team that I'm a part of is not a group of competitors, but it's a group of collaborators. And that's my mission. My mission is I believe that, leadership teams are everything to the success of a business, to the success of our society. And my mission is to continue to support leadership teams so that they can play at their best, which will enable those in the organization to play at their best. So yes, clear and compelling vision, number one, that's the obvious answer. But the answer that you don't really see, that I learned through my experience working with so many teams, is this quality called resilient relationships. They can really talk about the most uncomfortable things with each other and still walk out the room, have dinner together, and work together in a respectful way.
That's amazing. Thank you. Do you work with these teams and with the companies and businesses you work with? Do you work with them in person or remote?
Both. I think COVID threw a constraint in and required us to do things during COVID. I was supporting leadership teams in Scandinavia and in Asia and other places that I probably wouldn't have done before, because they would have said, we want somebody local, we want to use a local consultant, but we've heard about you, Dan, so we want to work with you. We can't physically get together, so let's do it virtually. So I've done that. But now that we've gone back into more of a reset where we can go face to face, there is also something about periodically coming together as a leadership team and discussing strategy and group dynamics and difficult challenges. And when you've got people in room looking at each other, and also that time in the evening to socialize and do things together and go for walks. I mean, you've spent time in Europe, you know how important that is. That physically coming together is also very important. So both, actually.
Gotcha. Dan, where do people find you if somebody is listening to this and is like, oh, I'd like to hear more about what Dan does?
Well, they can access me by just by going to Google and typing me in Dan Norenberg. You'll get access to a lot of resources. I write and speak to various groups, so they'll find my homepage where there's a newsletter they can subscribe to, and there's a series of videos on YouTube if they want to look at some of the coaching excerpts that I've done. I'm also pretty active on LinkedIn, so I'd invite people to connect with me, and if they've got a question or comment, they can reach out and call me. My telephone number's there, or email. I really like meeting people and connecting, and I'm really glad that I came across your piece and we got connected to each other. And I'm looking forward to learning more from you. So yeah, LinkedIn, website, YouTube.
Perfect. We will definitely link you up in the show notes so people can go and find you with a click. And Dan, it's been a pleasure meeting you virtually and speaking with you. This conversation felt like I was talking to someone I had known for a long time without knowing the details of their life. So thank you so much for making the time, coming on this show, and giving so much value to our audience.
Thank you, Ollie. I love your show and keep up the great work.
Thank you.